Okay, one more for today. And that is in the QPQI, someone had mentioned capitalism and Marx and Smith and moral sentiments. It is interesting to me that Adam Smith, the father of the free hand of the market, was also the person who said that you can't have a free market without some sort of shared value system, or people will be inhuman to each other, or their lives will be miserable. And by miserable, he meant you're going to get stuck on a factory doing one job forever. It's inhuman. And for taking advantage of each other, he meant everything that that you've seen. So in that world, of course, religion and shared values are a good thing, and you have to have it. The question that the student had asked was Smith a Marxist, which is an interesting spin because those were the things that, among other things, that Marx was complaining about or thought would cause trouble within capitalism, industrial capitalism, whatever we want to say. Um, but that comment got me thinking about kind of a broader way to think about capitalism. Um, and I get sort of a kick out of this. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is this is entirely me. This is not Marx. This is not Weber. This is not Durkheim. Um, this is not the anti-Marxists. This is just me. So if you think about capitalism, part of what you're getting at is, money flowing through a system. And the way that the system works is your business or person, whatever we're talking about in capitalism, is successful if the money accumulates, right? And if the money is drawing down, eventually you'll go broke, the business will go broke. And built into that is an understanding, or I mean, it's just the fact of the system that things that don't aggregate won't survive, and things that do aggregate wealth will survive. Um, okay, well that makes a certain amount of sense. Where I get a kick out of it is thinking about it in terms of comparing it to natural systems, if you will. Um, if you think about an ecosystem, resources flow through that ecosystem in a similar way that money as a resource flows through a socioeconomic system, right? So the sun shines, pla- the grass and the plants turn that sun into leaves and sticks and trees, and bugs eat those leaves. Cows eat the grass, and then I eat the cows. Uh, but joking aside, as the system progresses and the bugs, the animals, the bacteria digest all that plant matter, and then all of that goes into the soil, and you get a recycling, right? The new plants use the nutrients from the old plants, and they grow, blah, blah, blah. You all know how that works. So if you're standing in the middle of Nebraska, you only have so much rain. And so the farthest that ecosystem develops is a grassland. If you're standing in Georgia, where we have a lot of rain and a lot of heat, the ecosystem doesn't stop developing at grass. It keeps on developing and develops all the way up to full-on jungle, complete with all the animals that go along with that. So part of what's going on there is that sunlight is being collected as energy, and that water is being collected as part of the biomass inside the system. And you will get new species develop as you get to a large enough collection. So, as a comparison, when you think about the grasslands of Nebraska, as the sun shines and that energy goes into the plants, as the rain rains and that goes into the plants, before the Europeans started farming the central part of the country 150 years ago, you had something like 10 feet of topsoil. And so the accumulation of energy in that ecosystem represents the growth of that topsoil over time, which is part of the reason that the U.S. was as fabulously well-to-do, was because of the richness of the resources that they bumped into. And so that system was accumulating, but instead of wealth, it was accumulating energy from the sun in terms of plants and the biomass that makes up the soil. It was accumulating water throughout all of those systems, and there you go. So when you start thinking about the rainforests, not here in Georgia, I don't know Georgia well enough, but stuff like the Amazon, one of the things that's intriguing is the rainforests, after they're cleared, they don't grow back real well. And they don't grow back real well because for them, that biomass, that stored wealth, is in the ecosystem itself, not in the dirt. So when you slash and burn the Amazon rainforest and plant, I don't know, cocoa trees or something, it's not a matter of the cocoa trees go away and then the rainforest comes back, because that in order to grow that kind of diverse highly developed ecosystem, but without a ton of soil, it has to happen in the rainforest itself. It supported itself, which I think is really fascinating. And so when you think about then, so how can we compare this to capitalism and the economy in general? Well, in the economy, money as a resource flows through the system. With Durkheim, we talked about the diversification of labor, and one of the differences between tribal folks and contemporary folks would be just the simple absolute number of jobs there are. As money flowed through our system and our system developed, you ended up with in the same way that an ecosystem might grow new species if it's got enough surplus. Similarly, as your society, your economy grows and accumulates wealth, you end up with a surplus there as well, and that surplus drives diversification. So you don't need marketing until you have a highly enough developed retail system. You don't need marketing research until your marketing is developed well enough, and on it goes. And if there's not enough resources, then you won't have that diversification, and your system will stay simple. With a limited amount of rainfall, the grasslands in central Nebraska stay grasslands. There is still accumulation; it's happening in the soil, but the plants aren't diversifying and accumulating the way they would out here in where it rains a lot. Now, when you think about places that have been overfarmed or overgrazed, one of the problems is that the cattle eat the stuff down, and without the grassland that you started with, then the water doesn't stay in the soil. As the water doesn't stay in the soil, and the plant growth is limited because it's overgrazed, the that ecosystem stops accumulating, and at some point, it starts depleting, or it actually is depleted. All of that plant matter has been turned into goats and sheep and cows, and with the biomass dwindled down, that ecosystem doesn't hold on to the rain, and so that ecosystem ends up flattening out and de-diversifying. If you think about it from an area of over farming, one of the things that's a little bit sad, if you go out to the west, to the farming west, like Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, that topsoil is already depleted to a fairly surprising extent, to the point where if you go out in the spring during planting, when the ground is bare, the tops of the hills will be a light colored dirt, and then around the hill is the dark dirt, and that's because that 8-10 feet of dark rich topsoil has been either blown away or washed away in the rain, but all of that biomass energy has been turned into corn, right? Okay, so when you think of that biomass, it's worth remembering that really it's all an accumulation of solar energy, one way or another. Plants are solar panels. They turn the sun and water into plant matter, which then the bugs use the plant matter to eat, right? That's the way these things work. And so when you think of, and so these systems are accumulating energy, right, as a resource. As that accumulates, they are able to diversify, which further drives accumulation until you reach some sort of carrying capacity, whatever that is. I love how closely this resembles how capitalism works. This separates me from other sociologists because I get a little frustrated with complaints like, capitalism wrecked the world, because I'm not sure capitalism wrecked the world. Capitalism is how money flows through systems, similarly to how other resources flow through other systems. It doesn't necessarily mean industrial capitalism can't be dehumanizing. It doesn't mean that industrial capitalism can't, be damaging. That kind of blanket statement doesn't really work well for me. And so to tie this back to conversations from the last section where we talked about the Industrial Revolution, what made the Industrial Revolution important was that we were freed from the strictures of actual power. So you could have civilization without relying on animal power and or slave power, for a better way of saying it. And so to the point where almost power kind of didn't matter. And I'm going to put a pin in that for a sec. So recall, all other civilizations were or are acting just like ecosystems insofar as they're taking in that solar energy in terms of food for themselves, food for their animals. They're using that solar energy to drive their civilization, right? And plant more food for the next, for the next year. And if they and they were very, very sensitive to power. How do people live here in the South before there was air conditioning, right? How do people live in Saudi Arabia before there was air conditioning? And the answer is they were very careful about how they built their homes. They were very careful about when and how they did their physical work, so so that it wasn't too miserable and uncomfortable. And the same goes for people living up in Minnesota. Uh, those folks knew how to find and use food, find and use fuel for warmth, to make it through a very, very harsh winter. And if they burned through those resources too quickly, well, that society wasn't going to make it. And the advancing desertification of different parts of of the globe show you that there were civilizations that were overdrawing their resource accounts. Um, and if you take some place like Iowa and overgraze it and overfarm it, um, in a couple hundred years it'll be bare, and you won't be able to have a civilization there, right? That's the ecosystem, the civilization equivalent to going bankrupt. With fossil fuels, we have been able to divorce ourselves from that for some time, which I think is kind of interesting because our system accumulates wealth, and money is, a stand-in abstract for resources. But I don't really worry how much energy it takes to air condition my house outside of having to pay that bill. And as long as that energy is coming from nuclear plants, coal plants, we can burn more energy harvesting that energy and turning it into air conditioning than we gain. I think I used the example from an earlier discussion of driving to Chick-fil-A for lunch. Well, the Jeep gets 15 miles to the gallon. It's 5 miles to the Chick-fil-A. So I use 2/3 of a gallon of gas. I think a gallon of gas is something like 30,000 calories. So I use 20,000 calories of of petroleum, which, note, had to be pumped, shipped, refined, and turned into gasoline, and then trucked to the gas station for me to buy the gas. So that 20,000 calories is not the total of what I've used. The total of what I've used is some slice of all that other stuff. And what for? To buy a 2,000 calorie Chick-fil-A lunch? No, because I don't want to get too fat. So it can't be 2,000 calories worth of Chick-fil-A lunch, 1,000 calories of Chick-fil-A lunch, which is kind of wild when you think about it. So, trying to think of money flowing through these systems and other resources flowing through these systems is a very, very entertaining way to think about this, and that all comes from just thinking about Marx. I don't know. Marx would not, I don't think, agree with this analysis discussion at all. But that's okay. There's one more bit I was trying to remember. Oh, here we go. So we tend to think of Marx, I should have put this at the beginning, we tend to think of Marx as an anti-capitalist, and of course in many ways he absolutely was, but he very, very much respected the power of industrial capitalism, and he eventually thought, before you had his world of communism, that industrial capitalism would take over and then it would fall apart on its own. The thing is that when you read Marx and then you read some strong free market stuff, you realize they really are analyzing the same system. It's just a value distinction, how you look at it. So where Marx sees surplus value, and sees theft from the worker, the capitalist sees profit and sees a growth in the entire system. Oh, this was the last point. And sees some addition to the entire system, right? Somebody had to put together this business, this equation to make money. And so now something exists that didn't exist before. I wasn't going to do it myself, but I'll use this business to do it, and it costs a little bit more, and then everybody's a little bit better off. So so reading Marx made me even more appreciative of how markets worked than I think Marx ever would have appreciated. Okay, so here's an interesting point. In business, we are always trying to be more efficient, more productive, do more with less stuff. So let's step back and let's make a comparison, because efficiency is an interesting thing. So a theme in the QPQIs and some of the conversations I've had here is, does efficiency, does rationality, is it always good for you, right? And on one hand, the answer is obviously yes. But on the other hand, recall we mentioned, I don't know if these videos are going up in any sort of order. I might be talking about stuff you're not going to see for 3 more videos, but whatever. In some of these videos, we talked about, McDonald's driving out local restaurants, right? And there's something of a loss there, or the standardization of retail across all of our cities, making all of the U.S. that was built after 1980 look identical no matter where you are. If we think about, so McDonald's is cheaper food than you would get at a mom and pop local restaurant, because the whole system that McDonald's is built around is more efficient. You can get more food for cheaper money than you can at the mom and pop. What's going on at the mom and pop, however, is they're actually making a little bit of profit as owners, and their money is held in that local community. Now, if you really wanted to split hairs, McDonald's is their franchise, and so those are owned by local people. But let's not worry about that at the moment. And so that money is going into the local community. And if you have more employees, because your systems, your machines are less efficient, that money is also going into the local economy. So you're getting less hamburger for your money, but your money is swirling around inside the local economy a little bit longer before it exits, right? Whereas with McDonald's, I spend my $1.50 on a hamburger. Hamburger's not $1.50. I spend my $1 on a hamburger, and this employee makes a little bit. The people that made the machines somewhere else, they get their bit, and the rest goes to an owner somewhere out of town. So if you look at the Iowa or Nebraska prairie that I just mentioned, of course, it is opened. It is opened. No, see, that's work. The Nebraska prairie is not efficient, at least from a feeding mic point of view. You can put some cattle on it and they'll do great, but a grassland can only support so much cattle. So then you go and run your farming on it, and all of that productive biomass then gets turned into food, right? Into corn. And then eventually the first pioneers out in that era were using oxen and plows that dug a single furrow at a time, very very labor intensive, and the results were, by today's standards, pretty paltry in terms of yield. And then you add in the mechanized tractor and plow, and then of course you have the dust bowl because that causes different trouble. And then in the 50s and 60s, you start adding in fertilizer, and then the machines get bigger until you get to now. Those are very very capital intensive operations. You have a big tractor, a big combine, a couple of field hands for what would have been, 3 or 4 or more family farms even 30, 40 years ago. So in terms of actual output, that land is putting out far more yield in terms of bushels of corn than it ever would have in the past. It's far, far more productive, far, far more efficient. But here's where you have to start wondering about what efficiency actually is. And this is where the rationality question gets to be a little bit curious, right? And that is, okay, but now those towns are boarded up and empty, and you've got one fairly well-to-do owner and just a handful of not well-to-do field hands, where in the past you would have had, like I said, 4 or 5, 6 family farms, and a Midwest, and let's be honest, South Georgia, that was dotted full of communities because all those people needed an economy to support them, right? They created their own economy. Similarly, while in yield, bushels of corn per acre, those numbers on modern farms are enormous. When you think about, okay, but in order to get that, we're putting in diesel fuel, we're putting in fertilizer that requires phosphate, nitrogen, whole bunch of other stuff from really all over the globe. And that's just the inputs. The seeds are manufactured. It's not saved seed like it would have been 50 or 100 years ago. So there's energy inputs there. So there's all this energy going in, and at the out you get all this tremendous corn. Well, notice in the same way that the McDonald's gets rid of the local businesses, or industrial farming gets rid of small towns, think about what's going on in the biomass with pesticide use and herbicide use. What's growing in those fields is corn and only corn, right? And so the corn, as corn, it's very, very productive. And so you have to think about what you're measuring, right? You draw a box around corn production and you have super efficient, super high yield fields, right? You think about total biomass production, and it's less of a given, actually, isn't it? Because left alone over time, those ecosystems were, accumulating soil at something like, an inch every 100 years. That was actually driving wealth, and that was doing that without inputs like diesel fuel and fertilizer and pesticides and herbicides, right? It was doing it all on its own. In this world, with all of those inputs we're putting in, it would appear that we're actually losing topsoil and putting a tremendous amount of stuff into that system to get a maximization of corn. And so all of this is to, to continue that interesting comparison between capitalism and other systems, with resources flowing through the systems, accumulating, diversifying, or being drawn down over time. That's the first. And the second is, if we're going to walk with that analogy, what does growth and efficiency and productivity look like, right? I don't have an answer to that, but it's a lot of fun stuff. Okay, that is 30 minutes and 2 seconds. That's long. All right, bye.